The Steady State Sentinels, produced by the Steady State, a community of former national security professionals who spent their careers safeguarding the United States, at home and abroad.
Today, we continue that mission by staying true to our oaths to defend the Constitution,
uphold our democracy,
and protect our nation's security. Join our expert hosts as they interview field-tested guests whose unique experiences shed light on the crises and challenges facing our nation. Hello, welcome to the Steady State Sentinel. This is a weekly podcast of the Steady State, which is a nonprofit advocacy organization whose members are former senior national security officials drawn from across the intelligence, diplomatic, homeland security, and defense communities. And this week, we have the pleasure of interviewing our general director, our executive director, Steve Cash. Steve has had a very distinguished career in the intelligence community, in the Senate, and lately at Homeland Security. I first met Steve, in fact, when he and I were both serving at CIA, and he was an operations officer there for several years, and I really enjoyed working with him. The next time our paths crossed was at a biosecurity experts group, which Steve really honchoed along with Larry Kerr and some others. So Steve, welcome to this initial broadcast of the Steady State Sentinel.
Well, Jim, it's great to be here. I'm proud to be a part of the Steady State. I remember meeting you. I actually remember the meeting back then. I won't explain in any detail what happened, but I was blown away by a certain amount of creativity that you had around a conference table there. But it's good to be here and good to see you as always, Jim.
Well, we are really honored to have you on as our executive director, and I'd like you to just tell us about how the Steady State was founded back in 2016, what motivated you to do this, what its role is today, and how the membership of our over 360 former national security professionals contributes to the foundation, the securing of our national security and our democracy. Please go into this, Steve, and tell us about this.
Sure. The origin story, we weren't even called the Steady State back then. We got together in roughly November of 2016, after the election. Donald Trump had just been elected, and we had some concerns. Who's the we in that sentence? By that point, most of the people I had worked with had left the agency, either retired or moved on to the private sector, but we had kept in touch. And in fact, many of us had worked together on issues related to terrorism and the Balkans in the late Clinton administration. And the group that sort of had kept in touch were agency people and State Department people. We'd worked together, we'd gotten along, we liked each other a lot, and we were all concerned. And so we sort of started making phone calls and talking to each other. What should we do? Now, I'm sure we'll talk about this, Jim, but certainly at the agency, there's a real hesitancy to get involved in domestic politics at all. As I think it's been already said in early versions of this podcast, we didn't talk about it. If you'd asked me what party Jim Lawler was, I would have said, I have no idea, and he would never mention it. It was just not talked about. So we were very hesitant, but we were really concerned. This new guy, this new president, what seemed inexperienced and almost hostile to the idea of expertise in the world of national security and international affairs. After all, he was going to be commander-in-chief, and that's serious stuff. We felt we needed to do something. What could we do that we were comfortable with? And it was, okay, let's offer our help. We're a bunch of people who've worked in this world for most of our professional careers. We know a lot of things. And so we said, let's just offer. And so we wrote a letter to the designee for National Security Advisor, General Flynn. He was fired 2 weeks later. We hadn't had a response yet. So we wrote to McMaster, General McMaster, who took his place. He never responded. And soon after, we started hearing, even back then, rumors of retaliation and blacklists. And people got worried. And it was pretty clear that this administration didn't want our help. And we sort of went to sleep. We were never a formal organization. I don't even think we had a name back then. And, we had a mailing list. We grew to around 70 people, and that was it. And we didn't do anything until the Ukraine scandal broke. And that struck home for a lot of our people. Most of us had worked the old corridor represented by the so-called Iron Curtain, so running up from the Balkans all the way up to the Baltics, or I'd worked Russia, so we knew the area. A lot of us had worked on Ukraine issues. But the other thing that really motivated us was what was coming out in the press and what appeared to have happened. It wasn't a policy difference. It wasn't even incompetence. It was a president extorting a foreign leader for personal gain. And that for us crossed a red line that we thought was pretty far in the distance, and suddenly we were right there. This wasn't just a threat that policy was going to be poorly conceived or policy that some didn't like. And my goodness, with our group, getting a policy that we all agreed on would have been impossible. But this wasn't that. This was an existential threat. And we said, we hate getting involved in domestic politics. It's not a great idea. It's against our culture. And we'll talk a little bit, Jim, I hope, about why we particularly know how dangerous it is for our profession to get involved in American domestic politics. But something was different here. We had to do something. And we, sort of held our noses and said, okay, we're in. And we wrote and we spoke. And you can imagine the CIA people like, oh my God, talking to reporters. We wrote public essays. We spoke on panels. This was during COVID, so we never actually saw any human beings. And we eventually endorsed candidates, including Joe Biden, who became president. And that took us up to the election then. And, I have mentioned, and I think we should go into it more deeply, the idea that national security people, particularly intelligence people, just shouldn't be playing around in domestic politics. So I'm sort of proud of what we did, which is we did nothing. We said, okay, we're done. We continued. Our steering committee kept meeting and talking about their grandkids and golf, and also talked about like maybe we should be doing educational material or something like that. But we stepped away. Existential threat gone. We were gone. And then the existential threat returned. Donald Trump came back with more explicit campaign promises that represented everything that had brought us to the table in the first place. And so we reformed. By that time, actually during even the 2020 election, we had called ourselves the Steady State in response to these accusations of the deep state. There's no deep state, there's a steady state. And we are part of that steady state. And that steady state, it's not just national security people, it's all across the government. What makes America tick in terms of government, the people who do the work of governing and helping and defending this country. And it runs from the national security community to the Smithsonian Institution, to the national parks, to CDC, you name it. So we were the steady state, and we got back involved. We did a little bit in terms of the 2024 election, not as much as we had done. I'm not sure what we could have done. But after Donald Trump took over the presidency and we had the transition, we got back involved. And against all of this was a background that told us we were on the right track, and that was January 6th. We'd seen what happened. That was sort of what we were predicting could happen. But the idea that we would have what in our minds looked a lot like our members have seen a lot of capitals overrun by mobs. We've seen that one before. It looked a lot like other countries where the mob takes over. And we saw it happening. And if anything, it told us we were right. But we thought we were okay on January 7th when we had a President Biden on the way to being inaugurated. When he was inaugurated on the 20th, 3 weeks later, well, we were wrong. The existential threat is back. And that's how we got to where we are.
So if I can ask, Steve, when President Trump was reelected in 2024 and took office earlier this year, what exactly were some of the red lines that he crossed that you and other members of the Steady State, and I'm a member, I joined several years ago, although I've been inactive until now when I was asked to host this podcast, and I thought, I've got to do something. My older daughter, Elizabeth, who lives in New York, she said, "Daddy, please do this." And so I thought, okay, I've got to do this. I'm not going to just stand by and watch the erosion of our Constitution and our democracy. But were there any seminal moments where you thought, we've got to be more active? No, we're not the deep state. We're the steady state. We're not corroding democracy. We're protecting our republic and our Constitution. Tell me in your mind, what accelerated the greater activities of the steady state?
Well, in the first go-round, it was the Ukraine scandal. Since this election, the 2024 election, which you're referring to, the red line sort of had already been crossed in many ways because he ran on a platform of saying there was going to be retaliation against his enemies. And he didn't waste much time after Inauguration Day in making clear what the point was. The very next day, he pardoned all the January 6th people. I mean, you couldn't get a more clear red line crossing than that one. It's all right that you attacked the Capitol Police. It's all right that you were trying to kill the Vice President of the United States. It was all right that you broke into the People's House. It was all right that you were a violent mob. You committed crimes. You don't need much more of a red line than that. Having said that, the successive days up till today have won over and over again. I don't know if the metaphor of crossing a red line works anymore because you can really only cross a red line once, right? But
it's more of a red carpet.
It's a red carpet. That's a much better way to say it because we're seeing over and over again the telltale signs, the indicators of growing autocracy. He's doing the things that we've seen dictators and want-to-be dictators do over and over and over again. It's pretty simple wanting to become a dictator. There's some boxes you need to check. There's some things you need to do, and he's doing all of them. And up until today.
So I know that the Steady State tries to apply some U.S. intelligence community analytic tradecraft to assess these domestic democratic conditions in the United States and their erosion. How did you ensure that this analysis remains nonpartisan?
Yeah, it's interesting. Let me back away from that just a second to tell you how it came to be that we decided to do this. We've been talking about existential threat, and you just heard me talking about it, and I think you're going to hear a lot of people on this podcast talking about it. Now, first, I'm not an analyst, but we have a lot of analysts in our group. And at some point over the summer, we sort of realized that, wait a second, we're former professional intelligence officers. And if you sit around talking about existential threats and you do work for the CIA or DIA or INR at State Department, somebody's going to say, we're paying you to put this down on paper and stop just talking about existential threats. Describe them with precision, with rigor, and use the analytic tradecraft that we have taught you to do in the intelligence community. So we did exactly that. And the way we try to ensure that bias wouldn't creep in, that partisanship wouldn't creep in, that politicization wouldn't keep in, is we did what we had learned. We knew what the traps were. It's been written about a lot, and there's been some failures of the intelligence community in terms of bias and groupthink and even politicization. And we said, well, how do we avoid that? So here's how we did it. One, we got professional analysts. Nobody got to write our analytic piece that we wrote over the summer and into October assessing this, which is now up on our website, www.thesteadystate.org. Nobody got to write it unless they were a professional analyst. My job as executive director was actually to commission it, to put together what are called the KIQs, the key intelligence questions. That's a technique from the intelligence community. You figure out the people you're writing this for, what do they want to know? Why are you writing it for them? What is the key intelligence questions that they want an analyst to answer? So I helped formulate that because I sort of was the stand-in for the consumer. And by the way, the consumer, unlike in the intelligence community, where it's the president and the secretaries of the various departments, combatant commanders, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Congress, the only one of them that was sort of left that was a consumer was at least part of the Congress. But the big consumer for us is, if you're listening to this podcast, we wrote that for you. You're the consumer. And so we figured out what are those key intelligence questions. And then my job from then on was to keep my mouth shut. I'm not telling any of these people what to conclude. I'm just going to bother them every week and ask them if they're done yet, which was my main job, was to be a real pain in terms of getting it done. And they were told everything you learned in tradecraft, analytic tradecraft. So I'm not talking about the kind of, sticks and bricks, as we say, the recruitment techniques. I'm talking about the analytic tradecraft. You apply that here. So work in a group. Watch out for bias. Don't come up with conclusions that cannot be backed up with specific evidence. It's all the rigor that is brought to the table at CIA and DIA and FBI and places like that. And I think it worked.
This document that our group put together, identifying core trends driving authoritarian dynamics. Of all these trends, what do you feel is the most important warning or aspect that the public should pay attention to? What is, in your opinion, Steve? I know you've got a deep background in law and in intelligence. You've served not only at CIA, but Homeland Security. You served the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. What do you think would be the key warning or aspect that the public should pay attention to? I mean, we talk about red lines, maybe a red flashing light, a siren
red flashing
going on.
Light. I almost hate to choose among the sort of categories, because that's how we look. We had a number of categories, but I'll tell you one that is near and dear to us and which we know the most about, and is a real red waving red banner and flag, which is the taking of the security services. And Mark, did I use that word, security services? The security services, and turning them from a defensive set of organizations to essentially a guard of the leadership, to defend the leader. What do I mean by that? Many countries have national security communities, just like the ones we come from. And it usually involves the military, the intelligence services, and the national law enforcement services. When CIA people talk about the ones like us who are working overseas, we use a different phrase than national security community or anything like that. We usually call them the security services. And we are very well aware of how dangerous they can be. And they're also the first thing that the want-to-be dictator reaches to in the toolkit. So if you could imagine the old grainy footage of Mussolini on a balcony looking out over the crowd, you look at any of them, whether it's Argentina or in Serbia, wherever, you see those films, you'll always see, or almost always see, two sort of shadowy figures standing 2 steps back, 2 steps to the left and right. Well, one of them's the head of the army and one of them's the head of the intelligence services. They're the bad guys usually. And so the red flag for us, and it's also emotionally hard for us because we love the places we worked and we're proud of the places we worked, that they are being turned into instruments of putting Donald Trump in power and keeping him in power.
Not only that, but there has been a mass purge in several of these organizations, in the FBI, in the CIA, in DIA, in NSA, of patriotic, hardworking intelligence officers, very talented intelligence officers, and either because they're suspected of being disloyal to the White House or have had the temerity of maybe speaking out and refusing to do things that the White House wanted. What are your feelings about this? To me, it makes my stomach ill.
It certainly hurts me in the stomach too. The brain part of me is also saying, hey, look at other dictators that we have watched overseas. What is the first thing they do? Purge the army, purge the intelligence services, purge their equivalent of the FBI. You got to do that, or you're not going to make it to the kind of power you want. So it's both painful to see and terrifying to see. And it's not done in a vacuum. I mentioned there are other areas where the flags are waving, because you got to fight on a couple of fronts if you're a dictator who want to be dictator. So you got your security services in hand, you're purging, you're pushing, you're pressuring. Now you have to turn to the judiciary and the legal system, because you don't want them to stop you. You can't have an independent judiciary. So you start attacking judges. Usually starts out relatively benign. Benign's not the right word. You call them names. You say you're not going to follow their orders. You call them traitorous or left-wing lunatic judges. You go after the lawyers. I always joke, Shakespeare wrote, "First, let's kill all the lawyers." Well, that's not about not liking lawyers. The two guys in that scene talking to each other are minions of a dictator want-to-be, and they are saying, if we are going to be the tyrant or the helpers of tyrants that we want to be, first thing you got to do is kill all the lawyers, because they'll stop the tyranny. So it's actually a very positive about the legal profession. So that's a place you're going to look. Another place that's a red flag, and I'll leave it at that, is academia and the media, the two places that help us talk and think and speak and argue and do all the messiness of democracy, which includes trying to persuade each other of things and sometimes yelling at each other. And we've seen that over and over again. So the red carpet, God, I love that phrase. Jim, I'm going to use it over and over. The red carpet is unrolling, and President Trump is staggering down that red carpet with great speed, sometimes with not a lot of precision, but he's going down that red carpet, and that's what it entails.
Well, you hit the nail on the head when you said that one thing that really stands in front of authoritarianism is not only the lawyers, but also the press, the media. I'm a strict adherent to the First Amendment. In fact, I'm not sure if the First Amendment has any limits in my opinion, because my limits may not be your limits, or your limits are not my limit. And I do believe that we need a vigorous free press, a vigorous First Amendment, and that that it will be only the journalists and the free press that keeps us truly free.
I completely agree. Completely agree on that.
So since this assessment was released, have you seen any other events, and I'm sure there are legion, that have been unfolded that are, concerning us in terms of accelerating this democratic decline? What, any other little examples that the things that you wake up and you say, I can't believe this is happening?
Well, I mean, the last 3 weeks have been perfect. There have been so many, but the most dramatic and the most terrifying is what we're seeing in terms of the president's exercising what he sees as his commander-in-chief authorities, ignoring well-established law that requires congressional involvement in deciding to attack another country. And I'm speaking about Venezuela here, and that was then accelerated by a program of killing civilians who are perceived to be committing crimes. There's a word for that. We use that when we're looking at overseas entities. It's called extrajudicial killings. In layman's terms, it's called murders. You can't do that. It's against international law. It's against our law. And it is an action of a dictator becoming a dictator. Not only because he's doing what he wants unilaterally, as if he's an emperor, not a president, but it is a signal to all of this. Remember, one of the first things he said when he ran for president is, I could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and nobody would stop me. Well, he's shooting people, and he's putting it on video for us to see. We're the audience there. I know that the president of Venezuela is also the audience, but we are the audience there. And it's the same kind of thing when we're seeing the unending videos of ICE beating up people on the streets, picking up the wrong people, handcuffing children. It's not just because of the brutality of it, or whether it's some anger or racism against people from other places. It's a message. It's a message to all of us. And now the last week and a half, where we saw the vicious response to members of Congress, all of whom will come out of the national security world, not really criticizing, but essentially reciting black letter basic American law governing the military. You don't follow unlawful orders. It's not a tradition. It's a fundamental way that we look at things in the United States military. And by the way, people who think we're disrespecting the military by repeating that particular thing, that's dead wrong. It's what our military is probably most proud of. We're not the Russian army. We're not the German army. We are the American army. We follow laws. And this comes out of the experience of World War II and the Nuremberg trials. And today we saw basically the press secretary in the White House casually had said, we killed those guys floating in the water. That's a homicide. And, it's horrible. So
it reminded me of something the Russians would do, or something that the SS in World War II would do, execute people who have surrendered. Yeah. It made me sick when I heard about this. Before our time is up, if you could advise listeners on one actionable step to bolster our democratic resilience, what would that one step be, Steve?
The first step, and I'll give you a couple of other ones, but the first step, and we have a cute hashtag on this too, and it's why we exist, is get smart. Yeah, you'll remember the old television show. If there's ever a time that the American people have to take the civics classes that were canceled in our high schools 20 years ago, it's now. You need to learn what's happening. You need to read critically. You need to do all the things that a dictator doesn't want you to do, which is learn, speak, persuade, take positions. And then two other things you're going to have to do, and all of us are going to have to do. One, organize and vote. Just going to have to happen. We're a democracy still. This is how we can save the democracy. Our lifeboat is our boat. So vote, vote, vote. And the other is not only organize yourselves, but reach across. Before the Trump era, we had plenty of policy issues that deeply, deeply divided many Americans. And we yelled and screamed at each other. We voted for different people to carry them out. And that's great. That's what's supposed to happen in democracy. Whether you think A or B on Israel and Palestine or abortion or climate change, that's great. But what's in danger is your ability to actually argue about those policies. I just spoke at a college that had been roiled by these demonstrations on Palestine and Israel. And I knew that in the audience were people on both sides of that. And I said, at the way we're going, you are not going to be able to help argue, decide anything about our policy in the Middle East. It's going to be decided in the sit room with Donald Trump and a few of his kids and maybe a few billionaires he knows, and you'll have nothing to do with it. So you need to defend that. And those are the three steps I gave. Get smart, organize, and across the aisle.
Yeah, those are excellent recommendations. So if we had one overarching message from the Steady State to all Americans who are listening to this, what would it be to help safeguard our democracy? You've already said vote, and I think that's a key. Vote. Keep an open mind. What else would you recommend, Steve?
I think you have to get your brain around something that's so hard to think about and is so unpleasant and horrible, which is our nation is in existential danger that we have never faced, certainly since the Civil War. It's horrible to think about that. It's horrible to think that we're all in danger, that we are at risk. You're going to have conversations around the family table that you never thought you were going to have. Should you speak out? I'm thinking of writing a letter to the editor. Should I? Could that put my kids in danger? That's what lots of people all around the world have faced, and many of them have risen to the occasion and been brave and courageous in all different ways and in all different degrees. We really haven't had to do that across the nation, and we have to now. That's the message. It's an existential threat, and now we need America to meet it.
Well, I was shocked when I read about the fact that the 6 congressmen and senators who spoke out saying that military and intelligence officers do not have to follow illegal orders. And people criticized them for saying that, when in fact it's part of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And obviously, if somebody gave me an order that I thought was unconstitutional or illegal, I wouldn't follow it. But just saying that intelligence officers and military officers should follow the law, no, they don't have to follow orders if it's illegal. That was
exactly
shocking.
Right.
That was shocking to me.
Absolutely. And it's important both to understand that, but also to recognize what that means. Because if the military and the intelligence services can follow illegal orders, that is the communication method. That's the toolbox of the dictator, is giving illegal orders. That's how it's done. And so, yeah, it was heartsick. I was heartsick to hear that, but I'm optimistic. I always tell people, like, all of this bleakness, it's what keeps me up at night, but the optimism gets me up in the morning and back to work at steady state, because Americans have risen to the occasion before, and we can do it again.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for being on this is our initial program of the Steady State Sentinel. And it was a tremendously wonderful to have you here and to outline the reasons why the Steady State exists. And as Steve said, www.thesteadystate.org. And we will be coming back in another week with another episode. I'm Jim Lawler for the Steady State Sentinel, still standing watch.
Thank you for listening to the Steady State Sentinel podcast. Don't miss out on more insights and exposés from America's premier global security experts.
Also, subscribe to our Substack at substack.com/@steadystate1 and follow our social media. And join us right here next week for another exciting edition.
The Steady State is a nonprofit organization working to sustain our democracy and national security.
Join us and support our mission by visiting www.thesteadystate.org.